Hi, it's Hard Love. Welcome to the live YouTube reading of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare by Vern Bullough and Bonnie Bullough. So, we pick up at chapter 2. Immigrant Minority Groups. Immigrant Minority Groups. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel NEVEU. Thank you for reading with us. This is the book for the month. Chapter 2. Technically, a minority is any racial, religious, occupational, or other group constituting less than a numerical majority of the population. All of us belong to various kinds of minorities in this sense. In a more real sense, however, a minority group needs protection and encouragement from the overpowering majority, which controls the government, since they are often looked down upon because of racial, religious, or even economic reasons. The Constitution, in fact, was designed to protect such minorities by its due process and equal protection clause. Nevertheless, in spite of the constitutional guarantees, minorities have traditionally suffered all kinds of discrimination, even ostracism in the United States. In the early history of this country, minority status was based mostly upon religion, but in the 19th century, it became it, it came to be identified with place of national origin as well as religion. In the 20th century, racial and economic factors have more often been the basis for designation as a minority. Every high school student knows that America has been made up by different groups of immigrants. But it is not always so evident that these immigrants were themselves for a time minority group. Members and had many of the same problems as today's minority group members. Immigration was a traumatic experience. It took people out of their traditional environments and replanted them in strange settings among strange people and even stranger customs. Old modes of behavior were no longer adequate to meet the new and quite different problems of life. The responses of the newly arrived prospective citizen were not easy or automatic, for immigration had changed the underlying nature of the social structure to which he had been accustomed, and neither the complex of institutions nor the societal patterns which formerly guided him were present. Peace, highest heart, love, everyone. We're on page 19 in the middle. Though some immigrants became rapidly assimilated into the culture of new country, most of them tried to find people with like ways and customs, settling down together, fearful almost that if they did not retain at least some of their old ways, they themselves would be lost. In the long run, this in group identification of the members of minorities has been both a strength and a weakness for our society. The competing minority groups, consciously or unconsciously, helped us to achieve our own particular type of pluralistic democracy because the diversity of groups tended to prevent any one faction from achieving a monopoly of power. Even the basic constitutional guarantee of freedom of religion was due in part to the fact that Americans could not agree upon one single religion. On the other hand, ethnic status based upon religions Religious, not national, or racial identity has also been used as a basis for exploitation and conflict. Usually, as the members of the minority group achieved a measure of power and economic success, they were all too willing to discriminate against the newer minority groups, denying them adequate education and even health care. Inevitably, this discrimination led to conflict because the deprived groups had imbibed too much of the American dream to be contented with their second class status. And they too struggled for their share of the good life. In part, the history of the United States for the past 100 years has been the history of successive minority groups attempting to move up in American society and the reaction of the older established groups in opposing them. Although in many ways the American experience is unique, this is not the only country with minority groups based on ethnic identity. In Europe, minority ethnic populations have been created many times by changing national boundaries. With each new conquest, indigenous peoples in the conquered territories have had to adjust to new national identities and have often been pressured to adopt the dominant culture of their new nation. In some disputed areas, these changes in national identity have occurred with painful regularity. Alsace Lorraine has been French German, French German, and French in the past century. Poland, which was a part of Russia until the end of World War I, found its boundaries moved westward after World War II, taking in areas which had been German, and it lost much of its eastern territory to Russia. There are German speaking minorities in northern Italy and Italian speaking groups in Yugoslavia, Hungarian speaking groups in Romania, and the list could go on. Europe has also seen mass migrations of people such as the French speaking Huguenots into Prussia during the 17th century. Not all minority groups respond to their minority status in the same way. Lewis Worth, a pioneering investigator into minority groups problems, proposed a fourfold classification of minority groups based upon their dominant aims. 1. Pluralistic. 2. Assimilationist. 3. Successionist. And 4. Militant. A minority group with a pluralistic aim seeks toleration for its differences on the part of the dominant group, while an assimilationist minority craves the fullest opportunity for participation in the life of the larger society. Successionists, on the other hand, want to achieve political as well as cultural independence from the dominant group, while a militant minority sets its sights on domination over others. Peace. Awesome. Peace, peace. This is the book reading of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. Live book reading. Peace and highest heart level. In an earlier era, before nationalism became such a potent force, most European minority groups were pluralistic in their aims, content with retaining their own language and not religion, but not particularly vigorous in trying to change their situation. With time, pluralism often led to assimilation as the minority groups accepted the culture of the nation which had conquered them. One of the most notable examples was the city of Strasbourg in France, which, until its seizure by the French in 1681, had been German speaking. and Protestant, but over a period of time became French speaking and Catholic. Peace. Much love, much love. With the rise of nationalism, which gathered tremendous strength in the 19th century, many minority groups became more militant and sought domination by their group over others, as the Germans and Hungarians did in the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, while some groups sought self-identity, as did the Serbs and the Croats, the Romanians, and others who felt themselves subjugated. There are a few minorities, such as the Basque in Spain and France, who have maintained their identity for thousands of years. Aiding the growth of nationalism was the expansionist policies of the European imperialistic countries, notably England, France, and Spain. Many of the conquered peoples had never thought of themselves as national groups, but their common resentment against conquering powers often led to the growth of such feelings. This has created all kinds of problems in today's world, although in some areas the problem is greater than in other areas because of the nature of European penetration. In many of the conquered lands, the imperialist powers were content with economic exploitation, and they never became an important part of the culture of the conquered peoples. In some areas, however, the Europeans sent out permanent settlers, reducing the indigenous peoples to a minority status. This occurred with the Indians in the Americas, the Maoris in New Zealand, the Bushmen of Australia, and the native Hawaiians. At first, the European settlers in these areas were themselves minorities, but they were able to dominate the indigenous people because of their superior technology and ultimately because of their greater numbers. In those areas where the indigenous peoples were more numerous and where immigration was not so great as in South Africa and Rhodesia, the Europeans have managed to retain dominance through their greater firepower and political sophistication. In the Republic of South Africa, for example, the white Afrikaners of Dutch descent and the other whites of English origin number only 2 million in the nation of some 17.5 million people. There are an additional 500,000 Indians and a 500,000 colored whose racial origins are mixed, but outnumbering all of them are the millions of black Africans. Though numerically the black Africans are dominant, real power is held by the white Africans who segregate and exploit the natives, and to a lesser extent, the colored and Indian populations. A similar situation is developing in Rhodesia. Thank you all for reading with us. This is love. Keep it up, bro. Oh, thank you so much for subbing. Thank you. Highest heart love. American minority groups. The United States differs from South Africa in that the immigrants vastly outnumbered the indigenous inhabitants. Only the Indians and the Spaniards of the Southwest became minorities by conquest on their homeland. The other American minorities to which all the rest of us belong were willing or unwilling immigrants. The most unwilling to become were the slaves who were brought here and exploited by the European settlers. Other groups of immigrants might also have been reluctant to come, including some of the convicts transported to Georgia or the Chinese imported to build the railroads, but most others came willingly. It could be expected that the willing immigrants would feel more open to assimilation than conquered peoples, and this, in fact, seems to have been the case. It should have It should be emphasized, however, that many of the Europeans and Asians who came to this country did not intend to stay and settle. Instead, they were sojourners who planned to accumulate some wealth and return to their homelands. And in point of fact, large numbers of them did return, although not always with the wealth they had dreamed of taking back. Although the statistics describing immigration rates from the United States are not as complete as those describing immigration in the 19th century, early 20th century figures indicate that the immigration rate from the United States was not insignificant. In the 8 year period ending in 1915, for example, there were approximately 8 million immigrants, but there were 4 million people who left the country. It has been estimated that about 30% of the American immigrants who entered the country between 1821 and 1924 eventually returned to their homeland. It would seem that these sojourners would cling more to the old country customs than people who were planning to stay permanently. And this had an influence upon the immigrant communities. Moreover, there were probably many millions of others who intended to return to their homeland, but because of various circumstances never made it. Nevertheless, the goal of returning to the fatherland undoubtedly encouraged many of them to keep alive their old culture, thus slowing down the rate of assimilation and increasing the generation gap between them and their American born children. Adding to the gap between immigrant groups and other Americans was the fact that the homeland of immigrants differed from one era to another. During the colonial period, most of the immigrants were from the British Isles, with the largest single identity being Scottish Irish. The Scottish Irish had been relocated in Ireland from the Scottish lowlands during the 17th century, but discontented with an unfavorable land tenure system, they came to the American colonies in increasing numbers during the 18th century and settled along the frontier. During this same period, there were also a large number of German speaking settlers from a variety of German states and the German cantons of Switzerland, as well as some Dutch, Swedish, and French Huguenots settlers. Even in the early stage in the settlement of the colonies, the tendency for the various groups to form ethnic enclaves could be noted. One of the most striking examples of this separatism took place in Pennsylvania, where the Scotch, Irish, and German communities grew up alongside each other. The continuation of separate ethnic communities is still obvious in Pennsylvania, particularly among the old order Amish and other men, Mennonites who have managed still to cling to many of the customs of the 18th century. Refugees from the French Revolution swelled the number of immigrants at the end of the 18th century, but it was not until the 19th century that large scale migration to this country occurred. The first wave followed in the aftermath of the Napoleon, Napoleonic Wars, and there were increases during each successive decade until the 1850s, when more than 2 million Europeans migrated to this country. Although every country in Europe contributed to this outward flow, the majority of immigrants were from the northern and western parts of Europe. The reasons for setting out for America vary. There was a rapid expansion of population in Europe during the period. putting a premium upon land, and increasing numbers of people had heard of the land and opportunities available in America. Political discontent played a role as evidenced by the German migration following the failure of the Revolution of 1848, as did religion, witnessed the converts to the Mormon Church. But the most important motive was an economic one, as Europeans sought land, jobs, and better life. Great national tragedies also played a part of the displacement of populations. The potato blight hit Ireland's main food crop between 1845 and 1849, causing widespread famine and driving many of the survivors to seek new homes and opportunities in America. The 19th century newcomer was different from his 18th century counterpart in the area of settlement. Most 18th century immigrants had headed for the undeveloped frontier where land was available, while the 19th century immigrants, with a number of exceptions, settled first in the cities where they sought employment in the developing industries. The newly arrived people moved into rapidly growing cities. Low rent area slum is the term we now use. Usually located in and around the business or factory district of the city, as the more well to do residents had moved farther out. Adjustment to the new world and to new conditions was never easy. Affluent or successful people seldom immigrated to America, so those who did leave home tended to have meager resources, and what little money they did have was used on transportation to the new land. In fact, this was one of the reasons these people so often settled in the city rather than the countryside in the 19th and 20th centuries. Many of them lacked the resources to go much further. Strangers in the immediate world around them, the immigrants fought the loneliness of their condition and created a variety of formal and informal institutions to help them adjust. Usually, they settled in the same neighborhoods as their former countrymen or little. This is very key, guys. It's right here. Check this out. In the process, they created German towns, New Irelands, or Little Polands. Eventually, as these settlers became successful, some of them were able to move out into comfortable neighborhoods. The old ethnic neighborhood was then taken over by new immigrants who, like their predecessors, were attracted to by the cheap rents and central location. As the changeover took place, the new arrivals filtered into the district, occupying house after house as it became vacant until the whole character of the German town had changed to a little Italy or an Irish enclave, had given way to a Russian Jewish ghetto. This challenge to the old settled groups by the new was often associated with hostility and conflict. The immigrants were also exploited. Sometimes this exploitation was by individuals of the same ethnic group whose experience or facility with English enabled them to deal with the more established Americans. Often, however, the manipulation was by outsiders who had little sympathy with or understanding of the new immigrant group, but could use their naivety, poverty, and lack of English language skills to exploit them. Unfortunately, the very tendency of the immigrant to ghetto, ghettoize himself made him more exploitable. The land near the center of the city might eventually have great value, but only in terms of the land and not for the existing structure. Inevitably, the existing housing tended to become dilapidated, and essential repairs were neglected as the owners waited for their land to appreciate. The newcomers lacked the economic or political power to demand improvements. Moreover, the fact that they were segregated made it possible to neglect essential services in their areas without inconveniencing other citizens. So that municipal services such as garbage collection, street repairs, and police protection were inferior to those supplied the residents of the newer sections of the city. Schooling for the children of the new immigrants was inferior to that given to pupils whose parents lived in the more affluent sections of the city. Buildings were older, staff smaller, and the children left school at an earlier age than did children who became from who came from families who were higher on the socioeconomic ladder. This is deep. This is so good and so thorough, right? Yes. Oh, thank you for subbing. Man, much love. All the likes and subs. Highest heart love, guys. We are going to just read these books because it's most important that we educate ourselves and know our environment so we can assimilate correctly, and then we can make a better life for our family and friends. The tendency of the new immigrants to form enclaves based on ethnic identity also made it possible for other Americans to accuse them of clannishness and to argue that immigrants lived in squalor because they liked it that way. Inevitably, when members of the groups did accumulate enough capital to buy homes or rent more comfortable quarters, the racist justifications for their earlier exploitation gave them a negative image, which worked to exclude them from the outer sections of the city by informal pressures, agreement, and even laws. Irish immigrants, in particular, were targets for discriminatory action during the mid 19th century because they were the first large group of Catholics to come to this country, and many of them had arrived in the most abject poverty. Though America had been founded by religious refugees, most of them were Protestants who had built in fears of popery, which the large influx of Irish, and to a lesser extent German, Catholics aroused to fever pitch. Even in the colonial period, many of the colonies had charged the captain of ships who brought Catholic immigrants an extra head tax. In spite of the prejudice against them, the Irish were eventually able to make their way into better paying jobs in the building trades, as policemen, or as minor political officials. Their paychecks became their weapons against discrimination, and they gradually moved out of the central city slum areas. The ingrained nature of the prejudice against them, however, was probably not fully eradicated until John F. Kennedy, an Irishman and a Catholic, who was elected President of the United States, thus following in the footsteps of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a German background. Spiro T. Agnew also becomes a symbolic breakthrough for the more recent Greek immigrants. As the Irish moved out of the central city slum areas, they were replaced by newer groups: the Italians, Hungarians, Bohemians, Poles, Russians, and new waves of Germans, Swedes, and others. Again, the new immigrants employed in the most menial and low paying jobs were able only to rent quarters in the most deteriorated sections of the city. Few of the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were Protestants or even Catholics. Large numbers were either Orthodox Christians or Jews, so that their religious identity proved an additional source of prejudice from both Protestant and Catholic Americans. Here's a key part again. Those people most accustomed to minority status were the Jews. The word ghetto, which is used by sociologists and other scholars to describe segregated residential areas, originally was used to describe the Jewish section of European cities. It is believed that the word had its origin in Venice, which in the late Middle Ages had set apart a portion of the city as the Jewish quarter. This ghettoization of Jews in Europe had been partly voluntary for religious and cultural reasons, partly protective because of periodic outbreaks of hostility to Jews, but mainly for legal reasons. As the Jewish communities had grown and the boundaries had remained unchanged, the European ghettos cramped more and more people into a small space. Ghettoization also prevented the Jews' assimilation into the general culture of the surrounding communities. And in fact, large numbers of Jews in Poland and Russia did not speak the languages of these countries, but instead spoke Yiddish. With this background, Jewish immigrants came to the United States already prepared for ghetto life. They settled primarily in large urban areas, with New York City serving as the home of more than half of the new Jewish immigrants. Though there had been earlier waves of Jewish settlers from Spain and Portugal via Brazil and from Germany, after 1881, the largest groups came from Russia, including Poland, as refugees from the periodic programs and other persecutions. The already existing Jewish community helped the poverty stricken refugees survive, but it also helped cut them off from contact with other ethnic groups. Orthodox Jews, and most of the immigrants were Orthodox, were not supposed to ride to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And this meant that the devoted Jew could not move far from the synagogue. Successful second and third generation descendants of the immigrants who wanted to move out into more comfortable neighborhoods yet remain Jewish were forced to move the synagogue neighborhoods with the synagogue with them or change their religion to suit the realities of American life. Both of these things took place, with conservative and reform Judaism developing. But the nature of the European experience in the ghetto and the outside pressures of the non Jewish community made the assimilation of the Jewish minorities slower than some of the other groups. They also suffered greater discrimination in jobs, housing, public accommodation than their Christian countrymen who were often contemporary immigrants. College fraternities and sororities, for example, long excluded Jews because they were non Christian. Even in non sectarian state universities, many colleges and universities put a quota on entrance for non Christians. The growth of racism and the control of immigration. The wave of Jewish immigrants was just a part of the flood of people seeking new opportunities in the United States. In the decade between 1900 and 1910, immigration reached a peak as more than 8 million people arrived in the United States. Inevitably, the great waves of immigrants created hostility to the open immigration policy, and there was a growing racism toward the newer immigrants. As the Indians were the only indigenous Americans, it became necessary to rationalize the hostility on the grounds of other than simple immigrant status. To this end, science, or other rather pseudoscience, contributed a new justification. Sociology, which was only beginning to emerge as an independent discipline, made generalizations about the immigrant which have proved shocking to the sociologists of today. Nevertheless, through analyzing criminality, intemperance, poverty, and disease, these early sociologists found that the immigrant was associated with all social problems. This meant that either society was at fault or the newcomer, and it proved much too tempting to blame the problems on the immigrant himself. Sociologists adopted the dictum that societal characteristics were dependent upon racial differences, and a succession of books were published demonstrating that the flaws in the biological constitution of the newer immigrants were responsible for every evil that beset immigrants, America, from pauperism to depression to homosexuality. Historians, novelists, and politicians joined this movement, and a body of literature grew up expounding the innate biological superiority of Northern Europeans, with the corollary argument that all other peoples were physically and or mentally inferior stock. Joining with the emerging social scientists in the racist cause were labor union leaders who saw the new immigrant as a means for employers to undercut wages and undermine the craftsmen who then dominated organized labor. The first group actually to be restricted were the Chinese, with the passage of the Exclusion Act in 1882, which many of its supporters regarded as only temporary. The legislation was passed in response to the virulent anti Chinese feelings of Californians, who were convinced that Chinese coolies were suppressing wages. Local discriminatory legislation had been passed earlier, and the Chinese residents had been subjected to numerous incidents of mob violence. Rather than a temporary act, however, the Chinese Exclusion Act proved a harbinger of things to come. In 1894, the Immigration Restriction League was formed in Boston to limit the number of admissions and to select from among the potential applicants only the superior stocks related to the American Aryans. Various prohibited categories were adopted. In 1882, Congress had also barred idiots, criminals, and others likely to become public charges. In 1891, this had been extended to take in believers in anarchism and in polygamy aimed at the Mormons, as well as contract laborers. Adding to the anti immigrant pressure was the fear of radicalism by the business community, a fear sparked by the Haymarket riot in 1886, when five of the six anarchists accused of the bombing that killed several policemen proved to be immigrants. World War World War I emphasized the xenophobic tendencies in America, and when 100% Americanism was the order of the day, it was dangerous to champion the cause of the foreign born. In 1917, over the veto of President Woodrow Wilson, the literacy test was enacted into law, requiring every newcomer to the United States to demonstrate his ability to read. It was assumed by its sponsors that this would bar the Southern and Eastern Europeans without excluding them from the Northern and western parts of the continent, where the facilities for elementary education had become much more common by 1917. Such a differentiation was advocated because it conformed to the racist assumptions of the sponsors, but it was also politically strategic because it sought the support of those born groups that were not adversely affected. Since the Chinese remained the only national group with which was totally excluded by name, many Christian missionaries sought to remove the exclusion provisions of the immigration legislation because it proved a handicap to them in their missionary efforts. Earlier, it had been proposed to admit a percentage of immigrants equal to the natives already resident in the United States as an alternative to use of the literacy test. And this system, in the mind of several missionary leaders, had the advantage of not being aimed at Orientals in particular. This is so good, man. Wow. In 1921, Congress adopted a scheme providing for limiting the newcomers to 3% of the number from the nation who were living in the United States in 1910. But under this formula, Asiatics still received harsh treatment, and this heightened rather than erased antagonisms in the Orient. In 1924, a further restriction was imposed because the quotas were based upon the proportion of residents present in the population in 1890, which was before the large scale Polish, Russian, Italian, and Jewish immigration occurred. This act also completely excluded Japanese immigrants. With the 1924 Act, the period of mass migration into the United States basically ended, and even the anti Jewish programs of Adolf Hitler did not change the system. Millions of Jews were killed who might have lived had the United States been willing to amend its immigration policy to accept refugees. We're almost complete with chapter 2, guys. Thank you for reading with us. Thank you for being here. In spite of pressure, however, it was not until 1952 that the United States modified the immigration law to allow refugees as well as a few Asians to enter the country legally. Most of the Asians who became citizens under the provision had been residents of the United States for much of their life. More important was the refugee provision, which allowed Hungarians, Cubans, and others caught up in the turmoil of the post World War II period to be admitted. In 1965, there was a further modification so that unified quotas based on the percentages of nationals in the population in 1890 could be used by preference. Immigrants whose national quotas had been exhausted. Preference immigrants were those who would be reunited with their families or who had skills and talents needed in the country. It was this provision which led the so called undeveloped countries to complain of a brain drain, since so many physicians, scientists, and other such professionals were allowed to become citizens of the United States rather than return to their homeland after completing schooling. In 1968, there was a further revision with a yearly limit of 170,000 set for immigrants from countries outside the Western Hemisphere, with a 20,000 maximum from any one country, and a total of 120,000 immigrants from the Western Hemisphere to be admitted on the first come, first served basis. The health of the immigrants. All right, this is the last section of chapter 2. The health of the immigrants. We're down at the bottom of page 30. Most of the immigrants arrived in America in the exhausted state, worn out by lack of rest, by poor food, by the cramped quarters on the ships, and unaccustomed to new conditions. In the early part of the 19th century, sea travel itself was exhausting. The journey from Liverpool to New York averaged about 40 days, although favorable winds might lower it somewhat, and unfavorable ones might raise it to 2 or 3 months. Wrecks were frequent and disastrous. In one year in the 1830s, 17 vessels foundered on the run from Liverpool to Quebec alone. Mm. Fire was in ever present danger, and so was disease. Great numbers of immigrants came steerage class, and vessels before the Civil War were pitifully small, some 300 tons, crammed with anywhere from 400 to to 1,000 passengers. Though there were cabins for the well to do, most travelers lived below decks in the hold, which was about 25 or 75 feet long, 25 feet wide, and only about 6 feet high. Each family received a daily ration of water, to which they added larger and larger doses of vinegar to conceal the odor. In steerage, the passengers furnished their own provisions, and if they ran out, they either went hungry or had to buy from the ship's captain as prices they could ill afford. It was not until mid century that the United States government would specify the supplies which had to be taken on for each passenger. The only ventilation below the deck was through the hatches, which were battened down in rough weather. When the air was not stifling hot, it was bitter cold in absence of fire. Rats were at home in the dirt and disorder. The result was cholera, dysentery, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and a sort of generic ship fever. That might be anything. The normal mortality on crossing was about 10%, although some years it was closer to 20%. Some changes for the better came in the mid century. The introduction of steam in the 1840s and the appearance of the Cunard line and its imitators took over the upper class passenger business and left the immigrant trade to the sailing ships, which were consequently forced to improve accommodations. After 1870, the new emphasis on merchant fleets led France, Germany, England, and Italy to build larger ships and to give subsidies to the operators of the lines bearing their flags. Under these circumstances, the price of steerage passage on the steamship fell to as little as $12 and included food. By 1900, the traveler could count on a crossing of little more than a week in vessels of 10 to 20,000 tons. It was still not an easy trip since the ships were overcrowded. There was lack of privacy and the food was poor, but much larger proportions survived the voyage. Still, it is no wonder that so many were exhausted that they stayed at the port or embarkation without going on into the interior. Those who did move on used the railroads and often remained at the junction points on the route, e.g., Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, and Milwaukee, even though they had originally intended to go elsewhere. Increasingly, in fact, the immigrant came to settle in the cities, and rural, small town America saw proportionately fewer of the new masses of people that came in the last part of the 19th and first part of the 20th century. This occurred in spite of the fact that great numbers of immigrants had originally left with the intention of farming and tilling the soil. In fact, unless they had money and resources or organized expeditions as the Mormons did, few of them managed to escape from the cities. Most of them, even though of peasant origin and knowing only how to farm, became trapped in the city, able only to sell their strength, since they had little of the skills needed for other jobs. It was the immigrant who built the canals and the railroads and the early highways, which in the days before big earth moving equipment was available, required masses of men. The factories and the mines also offered employment opportunities, and some immigrants became machine operators. Many also opened businesses to serve their fellow immigrants as storekeepers, butchers, bakers, and so forth. Trapped in the city, however, life was still hard and death rates were high. New York City and the other major Atlantic ports, where the immigrant concentration was greatest, crowded newcomers into tenements. In the interior of the country, smaller units were more the norm. But it was not unusual to stuff it was not unusual to stuff six families into places built for one. This overcrowding helped to spread disease. Tuberculosis rates were particularly high among the foreign born population. The immigrants were also pushed into the least desirable places to live. In Chicago, it was over against the slaughterhouses. In Boston, they were hemmed in by the docks and the markets of the North End. And in other towns, they located near the railroad switching yard. One of the great problems in the tenements was that of sanitation. Many of the early buildings had been built without privies at all. From the mid century onward, most tenements were built with privies of water closets, which washed away with the sewage. That were located outside in the backyards and alleys. For those people who lived in the sixth floor, this arrangement was inconvenient to say the least. Later on, the modern flush toilet was developed, and the newer tenements were built with inside toilets, usually two on each floor. Mm. These were, however, open to all comers, but charged to the care of none, and left to the neglect of all. In the winter, the pipes overflowed, and weeks might go by before matters were set right. Some of the tenements thereafter retained the odor of human excrement through the rest of their history. Filth was inescapable. Open drains were common, and even in cities as large as Chicago. It was not until well until the 20th century that some of the sewers were covered, so that until the time fly-borne diseases were quite prevalent. As an adequate water supply was difficult to obtain, it was often necessary to carry tubs and jugs from taps in the alley. Water was connected to toilets first, and in many cases, water for drinking and bathing still had to be carried from a public faucet outside. Illness was rampant, drunkenness was common, and behavioral disorders and neurosis, all classified as insanity in that day, were ever present. America, however, was slow to deal with the problems. The New York State Senate in 1858 appointed a committee to look into the need for municipal health measures. It attributed the high rate of mortality in New York City at that time to the overcrowded condition of tenement houses, the want of practical knowledge of the proper mode of constructing such houses, deficiency of light, imperfect ventilation, impurities in domestic economy, unwholesome food and beverages, insufficient sewage, i.e., sewers, want of cleanliness in the streets and at the wharves and piers, to a general disregard of sanitary precautions, and finally, to the imperfect execution of existing ordinances and the total absence of a regularly organized sanitary police. Finally, in 1866, the Metropolitan Board of Health was established, and soon after this, New York City was given its own department. Much of the early activity of the board was motivated by the concept that disease was caused by dirt, and investigators concentrated on reporting defective plumbing or ventilation and tried to control contagious diseases through environmental sanitation. Immigrants and slum dwellers, in particular, were hard hit by the various epidemics which hit the United States in the 19th century. Cholera epidemics hit in 1832, 1848, 1849, 1866, and 1873. Yellow fever was more or less endemic during much of the 19th century, as was smallpox. Diphtheria and scarlet fever were major causes of death among children, and during the 40-year period of 1840 to 1880, scarlet fever was particularly virulent. Actual control of the contagious diseases was dependent upon the development of the germ theory by Louis Pasteur and others during the last part of the 19th century. The new science on bacteriology reached the United States in the 1880s, and gradually more effective preventative measures were taken against epidemics. Last pages. The epidemics, as well as illness in general, were more likely to hit the immigrants than the more affluent Americans, primarily because of the nature of the living conditions. However, the medical care of the poor was also inferior to that of the more well to do people. Hospitals were primarily charitable institutions, as we have indicated. They were not particularly clean, and though most of the 19th century they lacked any kind of trained nursing care. As we stated in chapter 1, well to do people were cared for by servants or by physicians themselves at home where there was less chance of spreading infection. Communities did little to care for the health needs of the poor. In 1859, the New York Infirmary for Women and Children appointed a sanitary visitor to give simple, practical instructions to poor mothers on the management of infants and the preservation of the health of families. But this effort was soon submerged in the Civil War. During the Panic or Depression of 1873, the New York Diet Kitchen set up food stations to feed the poor. And as conditions improved, the food stations became a milk station for babies. The most effective effort in this direction, however, was by the private philanthropist Nathan Strauss, who in 1893 established a system of milk stations by which 1902 were distributing 250,000 bottles monthly. The settlement house movement was also important in bettering conditions, serving in the sense as the modern community clinic. A settlement house differed from other social agencies in that it was concerned about the neighborhood as a whole. In, it sought to develop relationships among community groups of different cultural, religious, and social characteristics, and to help people act together to improve their living conditions and environment. The two most famous settlements, both of which were opened at the end of the 19th century, were Hull House in Chicago, started by Jane Addams, and Ellen Gates Starr, and the Henry Street Settlement in New York, started by two nurses, Lillian Wild and Mary Brewster. Both settlements emphasized healthcare and education and did much to develop the profession of social work and public health nursing. Though the settlement house movement, and particularly the Hull House and the Henry Street settlement, are now looked upon with universal favor and even reverence in their own day, they were considered to be quite radical. They helped to develop autonomous neighborhood organizations, and the women involved saw the poverty of the immigrants as something which could be corrected. Both Lillian Wald and Jane Addams were politically oriented and urged protective labor legislation, child welfare laws, compensation for working men when injured, and various other forms of government intervention to deal with the problems of the poor, all of which were regarded as alien and radical ideas by the more affluent segment of society. Half a century has passed since the end of the large scale European migration to this country, and new minority groups have emerged. Some of the problems faced by these new groups are similar to those encountered by the European immigrants, although there are some essential differences between them and those faced by Negroes, the Mexican Americans, and the Puerto Rican Americans, who are the major minority groups on the current scene. However, some knowledge of past patterns and events helps to put both the similarities and the differences in context. And that concludes chapter 2, Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. Thank you guys for reading with us. Chapter 2 is complete. Thank you guys so much. Y'all really awesome. Highest heart, love, and honor. Thank you. Keep it up, bro. Just awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the subs. Thank you for the support. We are now at the end of the year. I will be flying to Alaska tomorrow. So after that, we'll pick up on poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel NEVEU. Much honor. Peace, guys. Awesome. Another hour reading. We did it. We are getting it up for the people. Yes, yes. Peace.